Hi everyone, my name is Chad Toprak. I'm the director of Freeplay, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Freeplay hosts and broadcasts from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, where stories have been shared and games have been played since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to anyone watching who has a connection to the world's oldest continuing culture. Sovereignty was never ceded, and the violence of the colonial project is ongoing. Freeplay also stands in solidarity with Black communities, both here and around the world, against prejudice, injustice, and violence. Black Lives Matter is not a new or revolutionary statement, but it is one that needs to be said and said again and said louder. Thank you for joining us on this stream. This session is called Neither Here Nor There, Designing Far From Home, and it'll be given by our guest, Aaron Lim. Aaron is a designer of tabletop games, previously in Melbourne, and is now based in the Klang Valley in Malaysia. He mainly designs and publishes small tabletop RPGs on itch.io, but also works on card and board games and very bad wordplay. Please make Aaron welcome, and I'll pass it over to Aaron.
Thanks, Chad. Hi, so I'm Aaron. I really like the acknowledgement of country, and when we were preparing for this talk, Freeplay organizers sent an email asking like if we're comfortable or if we know to also acknowledge the country that we are broadcasting from. I'm coming to you over the internet from KL in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and I guess I'll admit my ignorance on the history of the indigenous people in Selangor and KL. I know a few, but I don't really know the full history of like the land that I'm in. Like the stuff that I know, stuff from our school history books go back to like the 1800s, and I guess we still have a lot, long ways to go in terms of how here in Malaysia we recognize and respect the indigenous peoples. But at very least, I want to acknowledge the Orang Asli and the Orang Asal communities here in Malaysia, even though I don't know the specific peoples who may have lived here in KL. So I'll get to the talk. My name is Aaron, like I mentioned. Chad already introduced me. Last name is Lim. That's my family name. My full name is Aaron Lim Jiafeng. And that's how you write it in Chinese. But no one calls me Ling Jiafeng except my like Chinese school tuition teacher from when I was a kid. Even my parents don't call me that. Even my grandparents don't really call me that. So I go by Aaron. I go by @AaronLime online most places. And you can see, sometimes on forums in Australia, if I put Aaron Lim Jiafeng, they might get confused where my last name is. So I often put Jiafeng as my middle name, which doesn't read quite right because it becomes then Aaron Jiafeng Lim. And if you don't put the name before your family name in a Chinese name. Or sometimes like this happened before, even in like the Malaysia airline system. I had a screw up one time where I almost couldn't board because they had put my name as Lim Jiafeng, one whole name stuck together. But yeah, that's me. And what I'll be talking about today is designing a game that I've made called Far From Home. I'll be talking through the design process, and I'll answer the following questions like, what is it? What is its design lineage? I'll talk about the context of its creation, which I've already started on. I'm talking about who made it, but also where and when, its design intents and goals, the why of making the game. And then I'll talk about the details of how it came about. I'll go through some of the paths that I started on but didn't continue, and why I made some of the decisions in the final game, and also where to go from here, because I do not consider this a finished game. Even though I put it onto itch as a paid project, and it's in homebound, but at the very least, I consider that part kind of complete. But I do want to continue working on it because I'm still not super happy with it. Continuing on to the context, I guess I'll continue introducing myself. All you know about me is my name so far, and what Chad said. I'm Malaysian Chinese. I come from an upper middle class background. I still am. And that does influence my perceptions on immigration, on how on the path that I had as an immigrant and designing this game about immigrants. I speak English as a first language, and then Malay, and then far behind is the Chinese dialects, Cantonese maybe from my mom, Mandarin because I studied it in school, but never remembered anything. Like I said, the thing I remember most about learning Chinese is like learning how to stack barracks in StarCraft from my friends, and Hokkien, which is my dad's side, and like I'm from Klang, so if you don't know how to speak Hokkien, you get beaten up. I mean, you don't get beaten up, but like, you know, that's kind of like the main dialect in Klang. I lived in Klang for 19 years, which is kind of like outside of KL, about an hour. It's like the Geelong to Melbourne. And then I moved to Melbourne for study. I did university. I studied in the University of Melbourne, and then stayed on to work and live as a permanent resident for close to 15 years. And I only moved back. I say only, but like it's been pretty much half a year now. In December 2019, back to KL. And I also put a list here of like the places where I lived: Taman Klang Jaya, Bandar Botanic, Parkville, CBD, South Bank. Like they're all kind of like middle class places, so you know where I'm from. And as Chad mentioned in the introduction, I make games. I've been designing games since I was a kid here. I recently like went back home to my old my parents' place and like found some of the games that I made as a kid, and like not bad. So yeah, I actually started making card games because I taught myself to like play Magic from the comprehensive rulebook, which I do not recommend to anyone ever. And then I got into board games and trying to design board games, and I got into getting involved with the board game design and playtesting community. And it's only been in the last 3 years or so that I started designing tabletop RPGs, even though I've played them for longer. I never really thought of like designing my own things. I mean, I GM'd mainly. And so I did game design for RPGs in the sense that I designed adventures for my friends, for my players. But I never designed my own RPG systems and as such. I primarily do it as a hobby. And again, this is an expression of the privilege that I have. Like I had a job that paid me $90K a year. So game making was a side thing for me. It's a hobby. Although I have made like, I don't know, 200 US all up lifetime from itch. And yeah, I've been involved in tabletop game design and playtesting communities. Incubator Melbourne is something that's going on now online, even though you can't meet in the pandemic. That's one I use to help set up in Melbourne every month. And I'm also not super active, but I've been involved in stuff that's happening with Tabletop Game Designers Australia and Tabletop Game Designers of Malaysia back here. So that's my background, who I am, as a designer making this game. So I'll go to talking about the game itself. Far From Home is a belonging outside belonging game based on the belonging outside belonging framework by Avery, Alder, and Benjamin Rosenbaum. It's a game about immigrants and outsiders, about exploring what it means to live and thrive in a culture that's not fully your own. And it is a personal game because I made it kind of like to express my experiences as an immigrant. But some of I don't know how familiar you are listening into this talk with some of the other things I'm talking about, like belonging outside belonging games and stuff. So I'll go through that as well. Yeah, so I basically forgot to skip to this slide. It's a tabletop RPG. It doesn't need a GM. They call it GM-less. Some people have started calling them GM full because in a way, everyone as a player in the game is the GM. You take the part of both player and GM. It also kind of belongs in the story game tradition. Like I mentioned, belonging, outside belonging, all of that. And I'll go through some of the key elements, the home, hegemony, enclave, circle. Those are the parts, the building blocks that make up the game. I also want to give a shout out, not shout out, it's recognition for their contribution to the game. V. Hendro did the layout and graphic design for the version that you see now. I usually do all my game design in Word, so having V come in and like make it look good was really great. Like she's a great designer, graphic designer, layout artist, and also a game designer in her own right. I think the Kickstarter just ended. As part of Story Brewers, they have 2 games for little box games that were on Kickstarter, and yeah, she's doing a lot of great design work there. And as I mentioned, the game is based on the Belonging Outside Belonging framework, which was kind of like put together in this dual game bundle called Dream Askew, Dream Apart, by Avery, Alder, and Benjamin Rosenbaum. So I'll talk about what that means, what a Belonging Outside Belonging game means. And it's a bit not tricky, but like there's a Belonging Outside Belonging game, but there's also the underlying system of the game, which is called No Dice, No Masters, because the game doesn't, like I said, doesn't have a game master. So that's why there's no masters, but it also has no dice rolling. Like a lot of people think of RPGs as things where you go in and roll dice and tell stories based on that. But what the No Dice No Master system does is it uses tokens to kind of like control the flow of the conversation, of the narrative that you're making together. You have weak moves which let you gain tokens, and strong moves which you need tokens to use. And so when your character does something that kind of like puts himself in a position of weakness, or like drives the story forward by like going kind of like down on a low character moment, and then you then spend you get a token which you can then spend to get something that's like a highlight, like a big and like the 2 points of the character arc, like the starting and the climax, so to speak. So that's what No Dice No Masters is. But Belonging Outside Belonging is not just that. Belonging Outside Belonging, through these are some excerpts from the book Dream Askew and Dream Apart. It's about it should be a game about marginalized people, like forming communities and trying to live within that. And like they said, Dream Askew is about queer communities in a future, in a dangerous future, and Dream Apart is about a Jewish shtetl in the past. So I consider, because of what that means, even though Far From Home is not exactly the same, because I consider it, because I didn't want to call it like a dream game, because a lot of games that are made in this form kind of like use the naming convention of dream, because the game doesn't dream. It doesn't imagine a hopeful or scary future. It's a game that is trying to work through and deal with what's happening now. Like, this is a reality of someone who lives as an immigrant in a system. And so that's why I did think of it as a game that dreams. It's a game that's trying to work out what's happening now. And it, like, the community that you're building is not something that you build. You're not like trying to build a new community together. It's closer to Dream Apart, I guess, in that it's a community that in some ways is kind of like built for you. You don't really have as much of a choice in building that community. Although that's, I guess, kind of similar to what they're trying to do in the Belonging Outside Belonging games. And I guess that's why I chose to call this a Belonging Outside Belonging game, rather than just following the No Dice No Masters system. And it also kind of like even in their design, they called Dream Askew and Dream Apart part of the Powered by the Apocalypse. It follows in that design lineage, which I guess some people have questions about, oh, what does Powered by the Apocalypse mean? Does it mean, the mechanical things of making moves and playbooks? But I think Vincent and Megri Baker, who designed Apocalypse World, put it pretty clearly and succinctly, saying that, if you make something that draws significant experience and kind of expresses it through the work, and call it from Apocalypse World, and call it Powered by the Apocalypse game. They're not prescriptive in that way. And so I can't speak for them. I can't speak for Avery or Ben. So I will talk about Far From Home and why I think it also follows in that tradition, because I think to me, what's really important about Powered by the Apocalypse games are they center the conversation as the main kind of like game mechanic. Like the conversation is core to the game, and the design of the game, all the things that you put into the game should serve the conversation. They give you prompts to push the conversation along in interesting ways. The writing of the game serves to frame a genre and setting that kind of puts the agreed bounds for the players within, like, this is what we're talking about, this is what this conversation is about, and we can continue talking and adding and taking away from it. And the stuff with the dice and the mechanical tokens and stuff, that's often it's just a way to deal with, hey, we are talking and making the story, and then we're not quite sure where this should go next. Both kind of outcomes seem interesting, so let's roll dice. Let's leave it to chance. So yeah, that's kind of like the design lineage of this game. And so I want to get to the particulars of Far From Home, and also this is why the title of the talk is neither here nor there. This is kind of like the North Star, or like this is the thing that I look to. This is a quote by Palestinian poet and author Mahmoud Darwish. It's an excerpt from Tibak, which is an elegy he delivered for fellow Palestinian academic and critic Edward Said. And yeah, it rings true, very true to the immigrant experience. Like, I also look to other writings by other writers, which I realize now I probably should have put a couple of them here in the slides, even if they didn't appear in the book or in the game. Like the part about having two names, like that's my experience as well. Aaron is not a Chinese name. It reflects one part of my heritage, where my Christian upbringing, my parents wanted a Christian name. I always joke, they just opened the book and picked the first name that they saw, which works for me, I guess. And Lim, my Chinese name, and Jiafeng, which is a name that I don't get called, but I still am proud of because it's a fucking pun. Ling Jiafeng means like the Lim family is like prosperous. I can't remember exactly what Feng means, but it's like all my generation have puns as name. It's just Ling Jia is the Lim family and like a positive thing. So like mine's like the Lim family is bounteous. So it's like, hey, you can't fault me for being someone who loves puns when you gave my name as a pun. And also with the languages, like I speak English as my main language. I brought up in an English-speaking household. My dad studied in the UK and came back and like made sure to teach us to speak English, because that's how he thought we could get ahead in the world, because you need to learn English. And then now, many years later, he's like, oh, you all should have learned Chinese more, because you're so divorced from your roots. And so these are the struggles that we have as diaspora, as immigrants, because being a Malaysian Chinese is also being a diaspora Chinese. Like, yeah, like I wasn't just an immigrant because of moving to Australia. And so that was kind of what I was trying to express with the game, like hegemony and home and like different parts of yourself, and fight, like trying to contend with both and more things. But it's because it's not so simple, right? Like I mentioned about like my Malaysian Chinese heritage as well. Like it's not so simple. Like I tried to simplify it into a system for the game, but even then, like if you just judge it from the standard of my personal experience, it fails. It doesn't, like a game can't encompass everything that is real life. And I don't know if we should try, but it's a way to do it. Sorry, I went a bit longer than I thought there. So what the game is you'll set up these things called the hegemony and home, which are where your characters straddle. Like you come from home and you go to the hegemony to live there, oftentimes to get something, and that's what the circle is. Circle is how you get stuff from the hegemony. And I'll talk a little bit about the details later. But you do that, and then you define the exemplars, like what the people at home look like, what the people in the hegemony look like. You define the circle that it's kind of like the party for like other RPGs. This is why your characters kind of interact with each other and spend time with each other, is because you're all together here in the circle. And then you make your characters. There are 6 character archetypes, which I basically just kind of followed like how many characters were in Dream Askew as like a guide, because like, you know, you don't, I envision it mostly being a 3 or 4 player game, and you want to be able to choose like 4 out of 6 is pretty good, and still lets you have interesting interactions between different types of characters, but you're not making so many characters that like other people, you know, because like it's a tradition in RPGs that people hack things and make their own things and make their own additional characters and stuff. So you have 6 data points in a line is more than enough, I think, to see the different variations of that. Setting elements, I cut down from 6 to 4, and that's just because I don't know how to make more. That's a thing that I might look at in the future. And when we talk about a GM-less game, this is how it works, in that when you are not in a scene with someone else as your characters, if you're not interrogating the game as a character, instead of just watching your fellow players play out their characters, you pick up one of the setting elements and you introduce complications or flavor or additional information, and keep the conversation going by kind of playing the part of the GM by taking the setting elements. I also provided 2 modes of play. The free-from mode is the most close to like what Dream Askew, Dream Apart were about, where you start this thing they call idle dreaming. You as you're filling out your character sheet, that's kind of like one of the reasons why the character sheet has a lot of questions and things that you choose. As you are kind of like filling that out, you are already starting play. Like character creation is play. And so like, hey, let's put a pause before you make a decision on choosing this character element. We can play out that scene of like what your character is, and like, oh, that kind of like clarifies what my character would be, and then I then use that scene to kind of like fill up or answer that question. That's a way you can play the belonging outside belonging games. But I also found, because like I played that, and I myself struggled, and like I think the people that I played with like initially had a kind of like grappling first few moments of like, oh, what do we do? I don't actually know what to do. There's too much freedom here. And so I introduced a structured version of it, where it kind of like, oh, do a thing where everyone's establishing their characters, and then it's just like a simple arc: establish, complicate, culminate. Yeah, it's basically just like providing a little bit of a guidance for people who might be who might need it. Yeah. So that's what a character, and I mentioned before, that's what a character sheet looks like. It's pretty similar to a lot of other games using this system. There are questions about, you know, describing your character, and then tips on how to play the character, or like the description of like what this character is about. Questions that you can answer to flesh out the character, flesh out the settings, flesh out the narrative that you're trying to put together, but also can trigger play and a lure that like kind of acts to like push other players along with you. That, hey, this is what my character is about. Try and if you interact with me in this way, you get something out of it. So try and do that as a incentive. That's why it's called lure. And then there's moves that I mentioned: regular, strong, and weak moves for each character. And that's what a setting element looks like. They have desires, which you can use to kind of tweak the tone of the game on like what the hegemony and the home are, like how controlling they want to be. Again, with the tips, and then there's some instructions. So like, pick up when and trade away when. It's just a reminding you, hey, when other people are playing, look to try and pick this up when you can, and then moves that you use to like introduce new parts of the conversation. All right, before I get into some of the other details of like designing the game, I want to talk a little bit more about context, because I think it's important always. This game was like where this game is like I put it into an anthology called Homebound, which is an anthology of games about home and going away. In a way, I made this game because of Homebound. I also shout out to Cecile Richard for the cover image for Homebound. It juxtaposes Klang and Melbourne, which are my two long-time homes, both of them. I spent almost half my life in Melbourne. So it was important for me as a game designer that I wanted to make something that kind of honored that or dealt with that. And I knew I wanted to make it because I was going to be leaving Melbourne. I knew 2 years, 3 years ahead of time that I would be leaving. Like the moment I got married, I knew that I had to pick a place where we would live. Like I'd been in a long-term, long-distance relationship for more than 10 years before we got married. And so we had to pick a place to settle down, like either Malaysia or Australia. And we picked Malaysia. And so the moment I got married, I knew I was preparing to leave. And Homebound is kind of like the thing that I wanted to do before I left. So I started talking about Homebound in January 2019 on Twitter. And I did that because I wanted to kind of put it out there so that it wasn't just a thing that I was telling myself. I put it out there and said, look, I'm going to do this before the end of the year. Because I knew by December 2019, I'd pack up and leave. And yeah, so How Far From Home was put out in July 2019. So right in the middle, kind of like right on time, because I then put out Homebound in November 2019. And part of the thing is that why I started designing games is also designing tabletop RPG games specifically is because of this movement, because I knew I was going to move. The first game that I made in this genre, it was a game that I just wrote out on a bunch of index cards, took photos of and put up on Twitter back in 2017, because I already knew I was going to be leaving by that, and I was grappling with like how to leave a place that I had called home for close to half my life, and it was also because like there were other friends who were leaving Melbourne as well, and so yeah, like because making tabletop RPGs was so tied into into the process of myself dealing with leaving a place that I had called home. And going to a place that I call home, but increasingly had changed my relationship with. I knew I wanted to make something that also dealt with how it was like to make that home, to how it felt to, instead of just leaving a place, to live in that place. And I guess Twitter is also a way that I had put up a lot of my game design stuff. I got to know a lot of other game designers and people in the game space through Twitter. And so I put up a lot of my stuff. I talk about my design stuff all on Twitter. And it's just a pretty important part of myself as a designer, finding my footing, finding my voice. And like the initial part of it was I just put a draft in Google Docs onto Twitter and like tried to see if I could get some input on it. And then working out that, okay, that like I eventually put up all my games on itch. I moved my slides out of position. And I guess the important thing why I wanted to talk about itch is that it has been also a big part of me finding my footing as a game designer, and why kind of like after I got Homebound out of the way, out of my system, making the games that were kind of like very personal to me, that then putting it on itch and then still having that outlet, and I was like, oh, I have a place that I can have a platform that I can put my games on, and I started making more games on there. I've been making like a game a month since January this year, so that's been a really good outlet for myself. And I linked here. There's a reason why kind of like itch is kind of like a place to keep an eye on for indie RPG design right now. I want to talk a little bit about that because I feel like I've been part of that kind of like wave going to itch for RPG designers. Not that it hasn't been happening for a long time. I think if you know Honey Heist designer Grant Howitt, has started using itch since like 2014. Like that's the earliest game I found of his that's up there. And then locally as well, I knew about itch as a place to put games up because I saw other local designers putting their stuff up. Melody Watson, Ash McCallan, Ben Sherry, Luke Jordan, all of them have been putting up their games since like 2016, 2017. And so when I started like finding a place to put my games more permanently, it's not just a Twitter thread that disappears. I put them on itch, and there was other things. Like I wasn't really plugged into a lot of like design communities. Like I know things were happening. A lot of things were happening on Google Plus and on forums like Storygames, and I think Forge had been dead by a few years by the time I started designing stuff. But all of that had been happening. But I think Google Plus shutting down was a big kind of like instigator for people looking for a more long-term place to put their games. And DriveThru RPG is where people go to as a marketplace to sell their games, but it doesn't have a lot of like good community building features. And so people were looking for places to put their games, and itch was really good. Not just as a marketplace, but also because it has a bunch of features. Like I think one of the big things is game jams. For me personally, having like easy access to like organizing game jams has been really good for me practicing my design skills. The Emotional Mecha Jam back in like early 2019 was the first one that I joined on itch, and then after that I've joined like 6-7 other more jams, and each of the games that I've made through those jams have been really have been really good for my personal development, and also like they've been good for developing the scene, I guess, on itch. There's like over 7,000, over 8,000, almost, I think by today there'll be more than 8,000 games already, and it's a good, like I like the itch ecosystem because like it helps people from like places that don't have access to a lot of these places of power, like because the barrier of entry is low. It lets people from like say from Malaysia, like if you look at Echo down at the bottom right there, that's from Tungkai Poho from Malaysia, and that got a lot of traction through the itch, the Set Mac Game Jam. And like you can see an Australian game here as well, Isaac Williams Mouse Ritter, like that's on like the front page of like when you look at physical games on itch, and so that kind of like lets designers who are outside of the main spheres like of the US, of Europe and stuff like that to kind of like get in there and get people looking at our things. And it also lets, one of the things that I really like and I've been trying to keep track of is like cool things that you're doing on itch. Like, so Ash McCallan I still haven't tried this game, but like it's a combo of Ruins is like a combo of a digital game with like tabletop meta game layer, or even simple things like making your page look amazing, like this game, The Wizards and the Waste, which has a really cool, like, you know, it has GIFs and a really nice design for the store page, which stuff like DriveThru doesn't really let you do. It also has links to like, hey, here's a playlist for when you play the game. And also stuff like Subway Runners, like giving you links to like a random character generator here that, you know, generates all the stuff that you need to play. You can just go to the website and generate a character and go. So stuff like that is why I'm kind of like really excited about itch as a place for RPG designers. But it's not the only place. There's a lot of places still happening. Like I think a lot of the OSR stuff is still happening on blogs, and like games like Actual Cannibal, Shia LaBeouf, the RPG. I believe the Reddit is the only place where you can get it. I don't think it's anywhere else. So as much as itch is like a great place to look for the indie RPG design, there's still stuff happening all around. Stuff is happening in Discords, in forums. So try and keep an eye out on that if that's something that you're interested in. Right. running out of time. I'll speed through this. Goals and intent. I already spoke a lot about the goals and intent of designing a game earlier, and also it's in the zine in Homebound. There's a commentary for each game. So if you do pick up Homebound, you can see my thoughts there. But I wanted to answer a specific question about that, which was who is this game for? Did I have a specific group of players or demographic for this? And this question came up when I was asking for feedback. And it was a really important question for me because it was something that I struggled with because I didn't really have a specific group in mind. I kind of like made it for myself. And I put up my answer here because that kind of covers it. I made this game for myself. I didn't really think that much about what I wanted other people to play it for. And I mentioned like it's kind of akin to lyric game design, and I don't really have the time anymore because I'm like spent too much talking about other stuff to get into the nitty gritty of lyric games. So I will tell you to look at Jade Dragon and Maria Misson's stuff on itch. They are really prolific lyric game designers, especially I think there's the Games for the Missing and Found collection. And Maria Misson's work is just iconic. So back to that. The short form answer of that, to me, because it's like PBTA games, lyric games are like people are like, oh, what is it? To me, lyric games are like poetry, right? Like you are using the language of games to write poetry, to express something through the language of games. Like people understand what games are, they understand what it means to play, even if they don't are not able to kind of like put it into words, but like there's some understanding of play as a language, and you're using that language to kind of like express yourself and make things that potentially aren't hard mechanical playable. I think Hologram had a really good talk at last year's Freeplay about stealth play, about how people play, and like how sometimes just reading something is kind of like engaging in a playful manner with it. And so I strongly believe in that, and like that play is not just about the mechanics of play, but it is about playfulness and engaging with these things. So I kind of like thought of Far From Home as like not a pure lyric game. Like I made it playable. It's like in a using a framework that is a playable game. I don't like saying the word playable anyways, but that's the shorthand that I'll choose. And one of the things that I struggled with was I didn't want this to be a thing where this is for non-immigrants to understand what it's like to be an immigrant. Not really. Like I didn't make it for you. I don't want you to do your empathy tourism here. Like I made it for myself and for other people who had gone through this to kind of like tell them, look, I've seen this, I've heard this. Like, maybe some of you can see this and say, yeah, we see the same thing, and we'll work through our messy, difficult feelings of what it's like to be an immigrant in the game. And I understand like most people don't want to play that in a game. I don't want to relitigate stuff that I've lived through and call it a game, which is why I consider it more a lyric game than a playable game because of that. Because I don't expect, I don't want to push people to play it that way. Like if all it is you read it and you get something out of it, that is fine for me. Like I said, I'm not a poet, I'm not a painter, a sculptor, or a writer. I can design games. That's what I know to do. And so I made this game because I want to see how far I could take that. Yeah, okay, so details. I'll blast through this as much as I can. Although maybe you are more interested in this stuff, you can kind of talk to me later or ask questions. So the game started actually as a hack of another game called Blades in the Dark by John Harper. In that game, you're playing like scoundrels and criminals living, difficult lives in Duskfall, and as part of it, you gain a lot of stress. And if you take too much stress, you get taken out. So one of the things that you do during your downtime when you're not running missions, stealing stuff, is you indulge in a vice to relieve stress, and or like in the beam saber, which is another adaptation of this system, called cut loose with your friends to relieve stress. and the first campaign of Blades in the Dark that I played was one of the groups was an immigrant group. They were from a place called Scotland that's not from Duskfall, and so they were dealing with a lot of like immigrant politics, I guess, or like trying to deal with the liberation of Scotland from Duskfall. And so when we had that, I was like, oh, like it would be good. It would be cool to have like one of the vices that you indulge in is like an enclave, a place where you can go and like I don't have to deal with stuff that is about Duskfall, about the place that we move to. I go to like a Scotland bar and like talk with other Scotlanders about Scotland things. That's what I was kind of like thinking about. And the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to expand on it. And like it's not just a hack to this like one game. And so I made it into Far From Home. And that kind of like dealt with that kind of led to like why the enclave was the first thing that happened. And because I knew I had to have an enclave, I had to draw the circles of home and the hegemony, and I added the circle. It's very annoying to me, like bad game design me, that I call it the circle because it's too generic. So this is kind of like the genesis of the game, this diagram, to have the enclave being the intersections between home and the hegemony. And the characters that you play are there. They're at the intersection of all those things. They deal with the hegemony and home and enclave and circle. And then there's a part there that does not deal with any of that, your own personal identities that are outside of all those things. So I wanted you to make characters that could interact with in that green circle, in the intersection of all those things. And that's why I kind of like had the game set that up first. You set up all those things, and then you set up the exemplars. Because in a lot of games, especially like PBTA games as well, and in Dream Askew, Dream Apart, you can kind of start playing the game just by like filling out a character sheet. And like a lot of times they give you example names and example looks and example genders in Dream Askew, for example. And then you fill that out, and through that you kind of like, oh, okay, if I'm this tells me something about the setting that we are collectively building. You know, if someone's name is like Giant Slayer, that means something for the setting. That means there are giants in the setting, and there are people who slay giants, and it is possible potentially, right? So you start from that, and then you build a setting out of that. But I didn't want that. I wanted the setting to come first, which is why I said define the exemplars first. Define how your character will be compared against others, because that's often the immigrant experience, that you'll be compared about how similar you are or how different you are to where you are or where you come from. So I wanted that to be the starting point, the exemplars. And this is an early character sheet. This is one of like the earliest versions of the character sheet, and you'll notice that it has a lot of differences. I mean, not that much. Like the main thing here is here with the labels, and if you look, that is reflected in the moves and the label moves as well. The labels was something that I took from a system called Masks, a new generation, which I fell in love with. Like that's a game that I really like. Ooh, I should clear those annotations. And in that system, labels are because Mask is a game about like teenage superheroes dealing with like perceptions from adults on themselves. Like I want to come back to this mechanic because I find it very interesting in how it ties the stats, so-called stats, into attributes, into the narrative and into like the core part of the game. Because being like the teenage superhero thing, a huge part of like teenage superhero stories is finding your identity. And being young, your identity is malleable. So your labels change, right? Someone will tell you that, hey, you know, you're being a menace here. You're not actually helping anyone. You're just a danger to society, and your danger label will go up in Masks. If you can't like refute that, or you accept that, oh yeah, maybe that's me, and then it becomes a source of like narrative complication and drama, and like it's really cool. I really love that system, and I thought of putting that into Far From Home, because that's a thing that we have to deal with as immigrants. Often, like you're dealing with perceptions of yourself that are, I mean, it's common to everyone, right? It's not unique to immigrants, but it is something about the immigrant experience, about how dealing with how people look at you versus how you look at yourself. And you're dealing with it both ways in terms of like what your home culture thinks of you and what your adopted new culture, whatever it is you want to call it, thinks of you. So why didn't I continue with this? Part of it is because I wanted to finish the game in time to like playtest it and like put it together for Homebound. And like, this is a really cool system, but like it's complicated. So I wanted to give myself a bit of permission, I guess, to like, oh, look, let's just go to a pretty straightforward adaptation of Belonging Outside Belonging of Dream Askew. I just less work for me to do. That's like, I will fully admit that's the number one reason why I made the change, was because like I didn't have the experience or confidence to execute on this well. And part of it is also because like it becomes like a really key part. Like there's a lot of moving pieces when you with the label system that I envisioned, and I also it's also not perfect, right? Like it needed a lot of work, because like the way you see yourself and the way other people see you, I didn't want to like tie that together so strongly. And like there's a host of other things that you have to consider about what does it mean to wrestle with these perceptions. And so because of all those things, I cut it out. Although I am keen to like look back at something to do with labels in the future. The other thing is the circle. This was one of the outcomes of like getting feedback for the game as well, was someone asked like, you know, the circle is kind of like it's just an excuse to get your characters together. There should be more to it than that, because everything else kind of like serves a purpose. And my important realization for that is that the circle is completely inside the hegemony space. It doesn't have to care about you. It's a part of the hegemony. It's not a friend. And this was really kind of like, you know, seeing things about like Australian universities looking at international students as like a source of revenue. It's like, I'm not here to give them an education, we're selling product, getting a lot of money out of it. So I wanted the circle to be a thing where like you as a character, you found it useful and you want and get something from it, but the hegemony also gets something from you, right? That's how they extract things from you. They extract value from migrants. I fucking hate sometimes like the rhetoric that migrants are only useful. Like there's the utilitarian argument that like, oh, they add so much to our economy and whatever. No, fucking humans. Okay, we're people that want to live. Like you don't need to argue for our rights as humans based on how useful we are. And so I put the circle. I changed the wordings. I put a bit language about explaining what the circle does. It's a two-way thing where you're extracting things from each other. And it's complicated because, again, I come from a place of privilege. So like the main thing I encountered this was through like education, right? But for a lot of people, that's labor. We in Malaysia here, our economy runs on the bodies of migrant workers, and we do not take care of them at all. We do not respect them, or often don't see them as human. And that is the circle, that you can tell yourself that you are running a company that gives opportunities to migrant workers and you're helping them, but you are a circle. You are extracting labor and value from them. So yeah, cool. In terms of characters, this is the original kind of list of 6 characters that I had for the game. You see that most of them are the same. The Seeker, the Hope, the Exile, and the Scion are the same. I dropped the Wannabe and I dropped the Desired. and change them to the transient and the companion. Reasoning for that is because, so the way the wannabe works is that you're kind of like a apologist for the hegemony. You go there because you want to be a part of the hegemony. You love the hegemony, and like, I don't really want to have that character in the game. But two, it's also a thing that is kind of covered in the setting elements when you're playing the hegemony. It's a thing that you can play as part of the moves that you can make as part of the hegemony. Same with the desired as well, because the desire is just what the hegemony wants out of you. And so having that, I just kind of like, look, I'll try and focus more of those elements into the setting elements, and I'll put new characters in, different characters in, and I settled on the transient and the companion. The transient because like I also had to like travel a lot for work, and like often only for like 3-4 months, and like just that experience of just being in a place for a while. Like it's not even on a holiday. Like I wanted to build, like meet people and like make friends there, but also know that like, oh, this is just for a season, and when the season ends, you know, things will change. So I wanted a part of that where it's like it's not someone who isn't so tied into and can leave the hegemony when they want, where versus people who can't. I wanted to have that exploration there, and then the companion as well is like some of those characters here choose or are able to choose to come to the hegemony for their own reasons, and some can't, like the exile. And the companion is one other way that, you know, you didn't choose. You can play a character that didn't choose to come to the hegemony. You came because you had to accompany someone else, and that's a more interesting, I guess, way of looking at it rather than just the desired and the wannabe. Same with the setting elements. I started with 6 because that's the template that was put together on Dream Askew, Dream Apart, and I cut down to 4 because if you look at it, the gears of the hegemony and wary eyes, closed hearts are this kind of like the same thing. They're just part of the hegemony. Material needs and the passing of time are also just part of the world we all live in. So I just cut it down. I think it would still work. 4 is probably the bare minimum of setting elements, I would say. So I hope it still works. And yeah, in terms of like stuff with the character creation, I think I'll skip some of the things that I wanted to talk about here because it's not that super interesting. So the only thing I'll mention here is because it leads into like things that I might want to work on further. Like all the strong moves, regular moves, and weak moves for each character follows a similar template. All the strong moves have get out of sticky situation, which is like the generic move. Each of them has like a generic move. Regular move is to take action, leaving yourself vulnerable, and weak is to succumb to the hegemony or home's point view of you. So I chose that because, like, you know, this is kind of like the core thrust of the game. It's to deal your weakness is put in light from the hegemony and home's kind of view. It's sort of often not a personal weakness. It's what other people perceive as weakness because it's filtered through all of that. Anyways, so there's also 2 questions which you ask for strong and regular and weak. And that's because like it builds it lets you build more of the setting around you as well. And what I tried to do, and in fact, this is like a hindsight thing where like, oh, I've been reading through the game again and saying, I could do a better job of this. Is that try to give one move that is personally driven, like it helps yourself or comes from your personal circumstances, and one that like deals with someone else at the table, right? Like for example, in the Seeker, you make tangible progress toward a personal goal. So there's something that a move that you can take for yourself, and then you convince some, and then so this is one of the ones that's not super great. So you convince someone to provide aid in your pursuit. So it has interaction with another player, but in this one, it's still kind of like selfish in that like it comes back to yourself. Yeah, so I'll skip to the end because we're running low on time, and you can ask questions about that. So next steps for the game, some of the feedback that I had is about adding stuff about safety and comfort, because it is a game that yeah, if you're an immigrant, like I said, like I do not fault you at all for not wanting to play this game. So I need to put that into writing into the game, that you have safety tools and discussion of like, these are the kind of topics that we'll be dealing with. And also context and expectations. Like, it's not enough to just talk about safety. It's also like, part of that is a conversation of like, hey, what is this game about? And I've recently started like trying to give more and more context for the games that I make, because rulebooks are amazing. You can put a manifesto in them. You can put whatever you want in rulebooks, and people will read them. And if it doesn't apply to them, they'll just not read them. So might as well put it in. So I want to put more stuff about the context of the creation and the design of the game. I want to, like I mentioned before, I want to review the moves and the tips to kind of see how they actually work. Because like I'm starting to learn more and more about like belonging outside belonging game design. Consultation and feedback is a thing that I mentioned a lot of times that this is a game that scares me, partly because like I'm talking about it from my own personal experience, but my personal experience is pretty privileged and doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover all spectrums of the immigrant experience. Like, case in point, like the front and center is the exile. I get to choose to come back to Malaysia. People don't. Like, some people, you move overseas because your home country hates you and doesn't think that you are human. And it is not a thing that I've, like, I'm a cis straight guy. So that's a thing that I definitely want to get more consultation and feedback on, and then play test the game. Any questions? You can get the game in the itch big bundle, the bundle for racial justice and equality, and also just from my itch page. How are we doing for time? I've got like 3 minutes, I think, to answer questions. Cool. Questions? I'm going to take a sip of water while I read these questions. All right, first question. What's some techniques and tactics to getting attention on our games on itch? Don't ask me that, because I do not get any attention off my games on itch. Do a free play talk, I guess, and like plug your game in that. That's one way of doing it. I think there are ways, and there are people who are like more experienced and have better results and knowledge of this. So I don't feel quite qualified to answer this one. I think look to people like if you're in the indie RPG space, look to Pam Punzalan, the Dev Taylor, and Swords and Flowers, Ben Chong. They have been doing a pretty great, and Jammy, Temporal Hiccup. Like, those are like just literally only the Southeast Asian creators that I know that are doing good at like putting their games in front of people on itch. But there are plenty of people. Just look to them. I commented in another talk that I perceive rulebooks as an untapped part of game design. What kind of ideas do I have in the context? Yeah, so there's a thing, and this is more from like board games, I guess, in that like rulebooks, there's been a lot of discussion of like rulebooks serve many different purposes. Like, part of it is to teach you how to play the game. But it also serves as a rules reference. And so this is what Fantasy Flight Games does, is they give you two rule books, one rule book to teach you how to play the game, another rule book that acts as a reference for any rules that, like, it's kind of like the comprehensive rules. And that's one way of thinking about it, but that still is thinking about rule books as a way of to serve the mechanical purpose of the game. I think rulebooks can do better to serve the thematic purposes of the game of games. I think the Czech Games Edition does a good job of like injecting humor and like story in your games, and there's a lot of like war games that like give you the full history. And as much as Phil Eklund is a racist shit, he puts a lot of like contextualizing information on like, oh, this is why, like, you know, in his space game, it's like, oh, this is all the current technologies on like space travel, and like this is all the information on like why this card on an engine works the way it does. So that's another part of it. And also it's just about like, just look at people who are designing games now and like how rule books, they use the rules and the design of the rules to evoke the feeling and the genre of the game. I think Ben Chong had one where it's like a whole mess of like different typefaces and stuff, and like designing the rulebook to look a certain way. Epidemic Ravatrol also had like Wolf Spell, which is like, because it's inspired by like metal cover album covers. They made a rulebook in the form of a vinyl cover. So that I think we're just starting to like scratch the surface of like what you can do with rulebooks, and especially because tabletop RPGs are often just rulebooks, there's a lot of stuff you can do, and like putting in essays and like instructions and like context of like, hey, if you want to start messing around with the parts of the game, having little, I can't remember exactly which book, but it had little call out boxes, like, hey, if you want to adjust your experience with the game, this is what you can do. You can change this rule. I play tested this, it works fine. I don't think I didn't want to put it as the final rule in the game, but like, you can try this other thing that I tried. And writing it in a way that doesn't have to be so stuffy and prescriptive as well. Sorry. Last question is, how many players is ideal for Far From Home? One, just read it. That's the ideal way to play Far From Home in my mind, because that's how I play it. No, I don't know, probably 4. You want, like, I think the best situation is like 2 people are interacting and 2 people are playing parts of the setting element. I think that's kind of like the minimum thing of like an interesting interaction there. So I think 4 probably best. All right, thank you for listening to this talk. I think someone from Freeplay is going to do a wrap up or not. Otherwise, I'll just wrap up myself. Check out Far From Home if you can and if you want to, and check out the rest of the talks. So go back and like listen to the RPGC talk. That was the one right before this one. That's a good one if you want to figure out what's happening with indie RPG design, especially in Southeast Asia. Okay, thanks. Bye.